It started in a small town on the edge of Japan, where quiet mornings were filled with the sound of cicadas and the smell of freshly cooked rice. In that town, a little boy lived with his parents and younger sister in a modest apartment above a local store. Nothing about their life looked special from the outside, but something inside that home was quietly waiting to be discovered. One day, when the boy was about 5 years old, his mother took him to a community center near their home. She was meeting a friend, and while she talked, the boy wandered off into a small music room. In the corner stood an old upright piano. Its wooden surface was scratched, and a few of the keys were slightly yellow, but to the boy it looked magical. He pressed one key, then another, surprised by the sound that came out. The echo filled the quiet room, and he smiled. That simple moment, a child pressing piano keys for the first time, became the start of a journey no one could have imagined. His mother watched him from the doorway, half amused, half curious. She didn't know much about music herself, but something about the way he touched the piano felt different. It wasn't random banging. He seemed to listen carefully, repeating the same notes as if he were trying to tell a story with them. When they returned home that day, he wouldn't stop talking about the piano. He even drew a picture of it with crayons and taped it to the wall above his small bed. A week later, his mother managed to borrow a small keyboard from a neighbor whose daughter had outgrown it. It was missing a few keys and didn't sound great, but to the boy it was everything. From that day on, his mornings began with soft tunes. He didn't know the names of the notes, but he started figuring out simple melodies he'd heard on television. His parents would sometimes stop and listen, surprised by how naturally his fingers moved. When he turned 6, his mother decided to take him to a nearby piano teacher. The teacher was an elderly woman who had taught music for more than 30 years. She watched the boy play on her piano for the first time, her expression slowly changing from polite curiosity to quiet amazement. After a few minutes, she looked at his mother and said softly, "He has something rare. He doesn't just play notes. He feels them." Those words changed everything. The lessons began immediately. The teacher taught him posture, scales, and reading music. But what fascinated her most was how quickly he learned. He could listen to a song once and play it back almost perfectly. While other children needed weeks to memorize a simple tune, he could do it in hours. It wasn't only talent, it was his love for the sound itself. He would sit in front of the piano for hours without getting tired. His parents sometimes had to remind him to eat or go to bed. At school, though, things were different. Most of his classmates were into sports or video games. They didn't understand why he spent so much time playing the piano. A few teased him for it, calling him the music nerd or the piano boy. At first, their words hurt. He would go home and stay quiet for hours, pretending it didn't matter. But when he sat at the piano, the world disappeared. The teasing, the loneliness, the pressure. Everything faded the moment he pressed the keys. When he turned 10, he entered his first local piano competition. The event was held in a small auditorium, filled with parents and students from nearby towns. Most of the performers were older and more experienced. When his turn came, he walked nervously to the piano, hands trembling slightly. The lights felt too bright and the audience too big. But once his fingers touched the keys, all the fear vanished. The music flowed out of him effortlessly, like water finding its way down a stream. When he finished, the hall was silent for a moment, and then the applause came. His mother wiped her eyes in the audience, unable to stop smiling. He didn't win first place that day, but one of the judges came backstage afterward and told him, "You have something that can't be taught. Keep playing no matter what." Those words stayed with him for years. The piano became his world. After school, he rushed home to practice. He would listen to famous pianists on the internet, replaying their performances again and again. That's when he first discovered Chopin. The first time he heard a Chopin nocturne, it was like hearing emotion turned into sound. It wasn't just technical, it was human. It spoke of longing, beauty, and quiet strength. From then on, he became obsessed with Chopin's music. Sometimes late at night, his mother would find him asleep at the piano, his head resting on his arms. She worried about him, but she also knew how much the music meant. Their family didn't have much money, but she worked extra hours at a local store to pay for his lessons. She told him, "If you have a gift, you must take care of it. Don't waste it, even when life gets hard." By the time he reached middle school, his skills had grown far beyond his years. Teachers invited him to perform at small events, and newspapers occasionally mentioned the young piano prodigy from a small town. But with that attention came pressure. Expectations grew heavier, and he started comparing himself to others. Sometimes after watching videos of international pianists his age, he felt small and unworthy. He wondered if he would ever reach their level. One day, after a disappointing performance where he made a few mistakes, he went home and told his mother he wanted to quit. "Maybe I'm not good enough," he said quietly. She didn't scold him. She just turned on the old radio, where a piano piece was playing, and asked him, "Do you still feel something when you hear this?" He nodded slowly. "Then that's your answer," she said. "You don't have to be the best. You just have to be true to the music." That night he sat down again at the piano. The same old keyboard that had once been borrowed from a neighbor now sat in the corner, still working despite its age. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play a Chopin piece, soft, emotional, full of heart. He played not for awards or praise, but for the feeling that music gave him. Years passed and his bond with the piano deepened. His teacher often reminded him that technical perfection meant nothing without emotion. "When you play," she said, "you must tell a story. Every note must come from inside you." By the time he turned 15, that advice began to shape his identity as a musician. He wasn't just copying others anymore. He was learning to express his own voice through the piano. The piano wasn't just an instrument, it was part of who he was. During one of his practice sessions, he came across a piece that would soon change his life: Chopin's heroic Polonaise. It was grand, powerful, and almost intimidating. The rhythm thundered like a march, filled with both pride and defiance. The moment he heard it, he felt something stir inside him. It was as if the music was challenging him, calling him to rise above his limits. At that moment, he made a quiet promise to himself. One day he would play that piece. Not just play it, but truly understand it. Every note, every emotion, every heartbeat. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He would need time, strength, and patience. But deep down, he also knew it was his path. And so he began to prepare. Every morning before school, he would practice scales and finger exercises. After school, he would spend hours studying recordings, watching how great pianists handled the complex passages of the Polonaise. Sometimes his fingers cramped, his shoulders ached, and fatigue made him want to stop. But something kept him going, and the same quiet determination that had guided him since that day in the community center when he first touched a piano key. The sound of the piano became a constant companion through all his ups and downs. On days when he felt lonely or misunderstood, he played until his heart felt lighter. On days when things went well, he played even more, as if to celebrate through music. His mother often stood by the doorway listening quietly. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she cried, because she could hear the emotion behind every note, the story of a child who had grown through sound, discipline, and heart. By 17, the world around him had changed. He was no longer just the quiet boy from the small town. He had become something more, a young artist on the edge of something extraordinary. What started with a single note on an old piano had now grown into a passion that would soon reach beyond borders, but that moment, the one that would capture the attention of thousands and make his name known far beyond Japan, was still waiting ahead, and it all began with the memory of that first sound, that single key pressed by a curious 5-year-old, echoing softly in a quiet room, carrying the promise of everything yet to come. As the months passed, the young pianist's world became smaller but deeper. Every day seemed to revolve around one thing, the piano. Before sunrise, he would already be awake, stretching his hands and warming up his fingers quietly so he wouldn't disturb his family. The first sound of the keys became part of the household rhythm. Even the neighbors, who once found it odd to hear piano music so early in the morning, began to look forward to it. The gentle sound drifting from the apartment window gave the neighborhood a strange kind of calm. School, however, was becoming harder. While other students spent their time hanging out or playing games, he spent his afternoons in the music room, practicing. His classmates didn't understand. They often asked, "Why don't you do something fun for once?" But to him, this was fun. The piano wasn't a burden. It was his best friend, his way to speak when words weren't enough. Still, there were days when loneliness crept in. He sometimes wondered what it would feel like to live like the others, to laugh with friends after school, to have someone to share his thoughts with. But then he'd remind himself of something his teacher had once told him. Those who follow their own path will often walk alone. But that's how stars are born, in quiet darkness. Those words stayed with him, especially on nights when doubts tried to take over. At 15, his passion began to attract attention. He was invited to play at a small cultural festival in a nearby city. The hall wasn't large, but for him it felt like a new world. The stage lights, the soft murmurs of the crowd, the heavy silence before the first note. It all felt magical. He played one of Chopin's waltzes, and by the time he finished, people were standing and clapping. After the performance, an older man from the audience approached him and said, "You didn't just play the piano, you told a story." That moment made him realize that music could truly reach people's hearts. He began spending more time studying Chopin's works. He read about Chopin's life, his struggles, his pain, and his deep love for his homeland. It touched something inside him. He saw a reflection of his own emotions in Chopin's music, the quiet sadness, the longing, and the search for meaning. The more he played Chopin, the more he understood himself. But talent alone wasn't enough. To reach the next level, he needed discipline and sacrifices. His teacher pushed him harder now. Some days he practiced until his hands trembled. Scales, arpeggios, complex passages. Again and again until every note sounded clean. Sometimes his fingers hurt so much that he had to soak them in warm water before continuing. There were nights when frustration brought tears to his eyes. He would hit the keys too hard, stop, take a deep breath, and start over. The piano for him was both a friend and a challenge, always demanding honesty. At home, his mother noticed the toll it was taking. She often brought him tea and reminded him to rest, but she also knew how much this dream meant to him. She quietly supported him, saving every extra coin to help pay for sheet music, competition fees, and travel costs. She never complained, even when things were tough. The boy often felt guilty, but she would always smile and say, "Seeing you play is enough for me." One evening, as rain poured outside, he sat in his room listening to a recording of Chopin's heroic Polonaise. The music roared with power, pride, and courage. It wasn't just a piece, and it was a statement. It was Chopin's way of saying that even when the world seems against you, you must rise. Every time the bold rhythm repeated, the boy felt goosebumps run through his arms. It spoke to him in a way words never could. He decided that this would be the piece he would master. It was a huge decision. The heroic Polonaise wasn't just difficult. It was one of the most demanding piano works ever written. Even experienced pianists struggled with it. But that only made him more determined. It was a mountain he wanted to climb. He began practicing it bit by bit. The first time he tried, his fingers stumbled. The left-hand octaves were heavy and the right-hand runs seemed impossible. But he didn't give up. Every day he played a few measures, slowly building control. When his arms ached, he rested. When frustration came, he walked outside for fresh air and returned stronger. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the piece started to take shape. He could finally play longer sections without stopping. His teacher listened one afternoon and said quietly, "You're beginning to understand its spirit. But remember, it's not just about strength. It's about heart." He nodded. He understood. Around that time, his school announced an upcoming music competition. It was the most prestigious event of the year, a chance for young talents to perform in front of professional judges and visiting artists. His teacher encouraged him to join. "Play your Chopin," she said. "Let them see what you've become." The idea both thrilled and terrified him. He knew this would be his biggest performance yet. Winning didn't matter to him as much as playing from his heart. But still, the pressure was enormous. For the next few weeks, he practiced more intensely than ever. Sometimes he forgot to eat. His fingertips grew hard from the constant repetition and his back often ached. But when fatigue whispered that he should rest, he would remember his mother's sacrifices and his teacher's faith. He kept going. The night before the competition, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every part of the heroic Polonaise in his head. His mind was filled with notes, rhythms, and emotions. He thought about the first time he had touched a piano key, about the teasing at school, about his mother's tired smile. All of it had led to this moment. The morning of the competition arrived cold and bright. His mother ironed his white shirt and tied his tie with careful hands. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I'm already proud of you." He nodded, holding back tears. At the concert hall, dozens of students waited backstage, some talking nervously, others stretching their hands. The boy sat quietly in a corner, headphones on, listening to Chopin one last time. When his name was called, he stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the stage. The lights felt hot against his face. The piano sat in the center, shining under the spotlight. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at it, the instrument that had been his companion for more than a decade. Then he sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The first notes came out softly, like a whisper. The audience leaned forward. As the music built, his body moved naturally with the rhythm. His fingers flew over the keys, sometimes delicate, sometimes thunderous. Every emotion he had ever felt, loneliness, joy, struggle, hope, poured out through his hands. When the final powerful chord echoed through the hall, there was a long silence. Then the applause started, slow at first, then rising into a storm. People stood on their feet, clapping and cheering. His teacher, sitting in the front row, wiped her eyes. His mother pressed her hands together, unable to stop smiling. He bowed, his heart racing. He didn't know if he had won or lost. At that moment, it didn't matter. He had done something far more meaningful. He had shared his soul through music. After the performance, a few judges came to speak with him. One said, "You didn't just play Chopin, you understood him." Another said, "You played like someone twice your age." Their words filled him with quiet pride. Later that night, when they returned home, his mother placed her hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way," she said. "But this is only the beginning," he smiled. She was right. Something had changed that day, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. The next morning, the local newspaper printed a small photo of him at the piano. The headline read, "17-year-old pianist moves audience with heroic Polonaise." The story spread quickly. Soon, people from other cities began asking about the young pianist from the small town who played Chopin with such emotion. He didn't think of himself as famous. He still walked to school, still practiced in the same small room with the same old piano. But deep down he knew that something extraordinary had begun. The music that once lived quietly inside him had finally reached the world. And as he sat by the window that night, the cool wind touching his face, he whispered to himself, "This is what I was meant to do." The piano waited nearby, silent but alive. He placed his hands gently on the keys and began to play again, softly, beautifully, as if the night itself was listening. After the performance, life seemed to move faster. The video of his competition was uploaded by one of the organizers, and within a few days it began to spread online. People who didn't even know his name started sharing it, leaving comments like, "This feels alive," and "He plays like he's lived through the story he's telling." He didn't have social media at first, but his friends from school kept showing him the views climbing higher every day. At first, he didn't know how to react. He wasn't used to attention. For years, he had lived quietly, hidden behind the piano, speaking only through music. Now suddenly, thousands of people were listening, but with that attention came pressure. Everyone expected more. Teachers, music schools, and even strangers began suggesting what he should do next, what competitions to join, what pieces to perform. Some wanted him to sign with music academies abroad. Others thought he should compete in the international scene. It all sounded exciting, but deep inside he still felt like the same boy who just wanted to play for the love of music. One evening, while sitting on the balcony of their small apartment, he told his mother, "I don't want to lose myself in all this. I just want to play honestly." She looked at him with a soft smile and said, "Then do that. Play honestly. Let the rest follow." Her words became his compass again. He continued to practice as usual, keeping his schedule simple. Every morning he warmed up with exercises, then worked on technique before focusing on pieces that inspired him. But now there was something new: invitations. Letters and emails came from music schools, concert organizers, even journalists. They wanted to hear his story. He was invited to perform in Tokyo for the first time. The concert was held in a hall much larger than any place he'd ever seen. When he stepped onto that stage, he felt tiny compared to the grand piano under the bright lights. But as soon as he began to play, everything else disappeared. The audience faded. The lights faded. All that remained was the music. That night he played not only Chopin, but also a few Japanese pieces that reminded him of home. The crowd responded warmly. After the concert, a young girl approached him shyly and said, "I want to learn piano because of you." Those words touched him deeply. For the first time, he realized that his music could inspire others, the same way Chopin had inspired him years ago. But even as his career started to bloom, the path wasn't easy. Fame in its quiet way can be a heavy thing. Every time he stepped on stage, he could feel the weight of people's expectations pressing on his shoulders. The applause that once felt encouraging sometimes felt like pressure now. There were days he questioned if he was truly ready for all this. His teacher noticed the change in him. During one lesson, she stopped him mid-piece and said, "You're playing well, but something's missing. You're thinking too much. You've forgotten to feel." Those words hit him like lightning. He realized she was right. He had been so focused on perfection that he'd started losing the heart behind the sound. That night, he didn't practice. He simply sat in front of the piano in silence, thinking about why he had started in the first place. It wasn't for trophies or applause. It was because music made him feel alive. It gave meaning to his quiet life. The next morning, he started again, but differently. He closed his eyes and played slowly, letting each note breathe. He tried to remember the 5-year-old version of himself who had fallen in love with the piano, without even knowing what music meant. The sound that came out that morning was softer but truer. His mother, listening from the kitchen, could sense the difference. As months went by, he received an invitation to perform in Poland, the birthplace of Chopin. It was part of a youth piano exchange program, bringing together talented students from around the world. He could hardly believe it. The country that had given birth to the composer he admired most was now welcoming him. Traveling there was both exciting and terrifying. He had never been outside Japan before. The flight felt long, and when he arrived, everything seemed unfamiliar. The language, the food, the faces. But the moment he saw the concert hall where he would perform, all fear melted away. It was simple, but beautiful, with a black grand piano waiting at the center, just like the one he had dreamed of playing since he was small. On the day of the concert, he decided to play the same piece, Chopin's heroic Polonaise. It felt right to bring it home, to play it in the land where it was born. When his turn came, he walked to the stage quietly, his heart racing but steady. The first note rang out, and suddenly, he wasn't in Poland anymore. He was back in that tiny practice room in Japan, hearing the rain against the window, feeling the warmth of his mother's voice. Every note carried a memory, every phrase a piece of his journey. By the time he reached the powerful ending, he felt tears in his eyes. When he finished, the room was silent for a few seconds, and then the applause began. It was thunderous, long, and full of emotion. The judges nodded in appreciation. But what meant more to him was the feeling he carried inside. Peace. For once, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just sharing his truth. After the performance, one of the organizers came up to him and said, "You didn't just play Chopin. You understood him in your own way. That's rare." Those words stayed with him for a long time. Returning to Japan, he found that the performance in Poland had caught attention back home. Newspapers called him the young pianist who brought Chopin back to life. It sounded strange to him. He didn't feel like a genius or a prodigy. He felt like a boy who had spent years sitting in front of a piano, trying to speak through sound. Yet opportunities continued to open up. He was invited to perform on national television, to give interviews, and to speak to young students about his journey. At first, he didn't know what to say. Public speaking wasn't his strength. But when he talked about his love for music, the words came naturally. He spoke about discipline, about loneliness, about how the piano became his voice. The audience listened in silence. But success also brought challenges. Long practice hours, travel, and pressure began to take a toll. Sometimes he woke up tired, his hands stiff from overwork. Doctors advised him to rest, but resting made him anxious. He feared losing his rhythm, his edge. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals, his teacher called him. She said gently, "Remember, music comes from life. If you only live at the piano, your music will lose color. You need to live too." Those words changed something inside him again. He started to slow down a little. He began going for walks, reading books, listening to sounds other than the piano. The hum of the city, the laughter of children, the rustle of trees. He realized that inspiration didn't only come from hard work. It also came from living. Gradually, his playing deepened. Audiences began noticing a new warmth in his performances, a balance between power and tenderness. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was sharing pieces of his soul. Months later, when he returned to the same competition where he had first played Chopin's heroic Polonaise, he was invited as a guest performer rather than a contestant. The hall was filled again, just like before, but this time he wasn't nervous. He sat at the piano, smiled softly, and played. His hands moved with quiet confidence, his music filling every corner of the room with emotion. When the performance ended, people stood, clapping for a long time. Some were crying. The boy who had once been teased for playing piano every day had now become a symbol of hope for others, proof that passion and perseverance could turn even the simplest beginnings into something beautiful. Later that night, as he sat by his window, he thought about how far he had come, from that old keyboard in a small apartment to playing in another country. Yet even now he didn't feel finished. He felt like he was still learning, still growing, still finding new ways to understand the piano. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once been small and clumsy, now strong and sure. He smiled quietly. The journey had never been about fame. It had always been about connection, between his heart and the music, between his story and the world. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and he could almost hear Chopin's melody in the distance, soft, distant, and eternal. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Then, as always, he sat back at the piano, ready to begin again. The sun had barely risen when the soft sound of piano keys floated through the small apartment. It was the same sound that had filled those walls for years, but something was different now. The music was no longer playful or hesitant. It carried the weight of purpose, of someone who knew that every note could change everything. For months, the 17-year-old pianist had been preparing for a single piece, Chopin's heroic Polonaise. It was a mountain of music, a piece known to break even seasoned pianists. It demanded strength, emotion, and courage. Every day began with the same thought, "Can I really do this?" And every night ended with fingers aching yet refusing to stop. The room they practiced in was small. The piano was old, its keys yellowed from time, but it had become their closest friend. When they sat down in front of it, the world outside disappeared. No sounds of traffic, no worries about school, no whispers about how impossible it was to reach the top in the world of classical music. Only the piano and the beating of their own heart existed. Sometimes during practice, their mother would stand quietly at the doorway, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She didn't say much, but her eyes said everything: pride, worry, and love. She had worked so hard for this dream, too. Every extra hour she worked, every meal she skipped, every late night she stayed awake waiting for her child to finish practice. It was all part of this shared journey. The pianist often thought about the meaning of Chopin's heroic Polonaise. It wasn't just a song. It was a story of bravery, of standing tall when everything seems lost. It spoke of pride, resistance, and hope. Every time they played it, they felt a rush of something deep inside, something that reminded them of their own struggles. The long nights, the doubts, the failures, the lonely moments when it seemed no one understood. Maybe that was why they connected so deeply with this piece. At first, mastering the Polonaise felt impossible. The rhythm was complex, the tempo unforgiving. The left hand demanded power, the right hand demanded grace. One wrong movement could break the entire flow. It wasn't enough to just play it, it had to be felt. The pianist spent hours just trying to understand what Chopin wanted to express through those notes. They watched videos of great pianists performing it, not to copy them, but to learn how each one gave the piece their own heart. Some played it like a battle, fierce and stormy. Others made it sound like a cry of triumph. The young pianist wanted to find their own voice within it. So they played it again and again, sometimes closing their eyes, letting emotion lead their fingers. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Friends went out for fun. School events passed by, and birthdays were quietly celebrated in the corner of that small apartment. Every choice led back to the piano. Some nights, when the fatigue became too much, they would rest their head on the keys, the faint echo of the last note still vibrating under their skin. There were moments of doubt. Sometimes the piece sounded perfect, and the next day it fell apart. The frustration was unbearable. The pianist began to question everything. Maybe the teachers were right, maybe they weren't ready for such a difficult composition. But then, they remembered all the years that led to this. The sacrifices, the small victories, the dream that refused to die. Giving up was not an option. One evening, as the rain fell softly outside, the pianist sat in front of the piano longer than usual. Their fingers trembled slightly from exhaustion. But when they began playing, something magical happened. The music didn't sound like practice anymore. It sounded alive. Each note carried meaning, emotion, and truth. The power of the heroic Polonaise filled the room like a storm breaking open. Their mother listened quietly, tears forming in her eyes. She didn't need to say a word. She knew this was it. This was the moment her child had found their voice. Soon after, news came that changed everything. The pianist had been invited to perform at a national competition. It was one of the most respected events in the country, where the most talented young musicians from across Japan would compete. The heroic Polonaise would be their piece. When they received the letter, their hands shook so hard they almost dropped it. Excitement and fear mixed together in their chest. For days they could hardly sleep. The thought of standing on that stage in front of hundreds of people felt terrifying. But beneath the fear was something stronger: determination. They didn't want to prove anything to the world. They only wanted to give everything they had to the music they loved. The following weeks were intense. The pianists practiced every morning before school and every night until their fingers felt numb. Sometimes they recorded their sessions, listening to every mistake, every uneven rhythm. Their teacher guided them gently, reminding them that perfection wasn't the goal, expression was. "Don't play the piano," the teacher once said softly. "Speak through it." As the competition day drew closer, the pianist began to visualize the stage. The lights, the silence, the grand piano waiting in the center. They imagined walking up calmly, sitting down, taking a deep breath and letting the first notes fill the air. They imagined the emotion they would pour into every measure, how the music would tell their story without words. The night before the competition, the pianist couldn't sleep. The moonlight poured through the window as they sat by the piano one last time. They didn't play the full piece, on just a few bars, slowly, gently, as if whispering a promise to themselves. The sound was soft and peaceful. Then they closed the lid, touched the wood gently, and whispered, "Tomorrow, let's do our best." The morning came bright and clear. The pianist wore a simple black outfit, their hair neatly tied back. Their mother walked beside them to the concert hall, holding their hand tightly. She didn't speak much, just smiled in that quiet way that said everything. When they entered the hall, it felt enormous. The stage looked both inviting and intimidating. The other contestants were older, some from elite schools, some already performing internationally. For a moment, the pianist felt small, just a young person from a modest background standing among prodigies. But then they remembered all those years of playing alone in that small room, all the nights spent learning the language of Chopin's heart. This was where it all led. When their name was called, they walked slowly toward the piano. The hall fell silent. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps on the wooden floor. They sat down, adjusted the bench, placed their fingers lightly on the keys, and took a deep breath. The first notes of Chopin's heroic Polonaise rang out, deep, bold, and commanding. The music seemed to lift the air itself. Every note that followed told a story, not just Chopin's story, but theirs too. It was the story of every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt that turned into strength. By the time they reached the final section, something powerful filled the hall. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling. When the last chord thundered out, there was a long, stunned silence before the entire hall erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, like a wave washing over the young pianist. In that moment, they didn't think about winning or losing. They didn't think about the judges or the competition. They only felt gratitude for the piano, for the music, for their mother, and for every moment that led them there. As they stood and bowed, the light from above caught the small shine of tears in their eyes. The applause kept going, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to smile. It wasn't just a performance, it was a breakthrough, a moment that would forever change their life. The sound of applause still echoed in the young pianist's ears long after they left the stage. It felt unreal. For a moment, they just stood backstage, staring at their trembling hands. The sweat on their fingers shimmered under the lights. They had played Chopin's heroic Polonaise with everything they had inside them, and the crowd's reaction still felt like a dream. One of the stage assistants came over with a soft smile, offering a towel and a bottle of water. The pianist thanked them quietly, bowing politely. still lost in the afterglow of the performance. The music still played in their head, every note alive and burning. They sat down in a corner trying to breathe normally again. The competition wasn't over yet. More performers were waiting for their turn. But something inside them already knew that this performance had been special. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about the feeling that for once the piano had spoken exactly what their heart wanted to say. When their mother met them backstage, her eyes were full of tears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just took their hands and held them tightly. The pianist could feel her shaking slightly, overwhelmed with pride and relief. For years she had been their quiet supporter, the one who kept them going when everything felt impossible. This moment belonged to her just as much. Later that night, when they finally returned home, the young pianist placed their fingers softly on the piano again. The same instrument that had carried them through sleepless nights and long days. The same piano that had heard their doubts, their tears, and their small victories. Now, it stood there quietly, as if it too understood what had just happened. They played the final few lines of the heroic Polonaise again, this time slower, gentler, almost like saying goodbye. The sound was warm and peaceful. The competition results would be announced the next morning, but strangely, they didn't feel nervous anymore. For the first time, they felt free. The next day, the hall was filled again, this time with chatter and excitement. The finalists sat together, waiting for the judge's decision. The pianist sat quietly in the corner, their hands folded in their lap. When the announcer stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. Names were called, prizes were listed. And then it happened. When the pianist's name was read as the top performer of the competition, the audience erupted in applause. The sound washed over them like a wave. For a brief moment, everything around blurred, the people, the lights, the noise. All they could hear was their heartbeat. When they stood up and bowed, the applause grew louder. Their mother's eyes shone brighter than ever, but the story didn't end there. That performance and that single moment on stage had been recorded. Someone from the competition team uploaded the video online the same evening. At first, it was just another post among many others. But within hours, it began to spread. People started sharing it, commenting, reacting with disbelief. How can someone so young play with such maturity? This isn't just skill. This is pure emotion. I've never heard the heroic Polonaise like this before. The comments came from Japan, then from across the world. Within days, the video had millions of views. The pianist didn't even know at first. They weren't used to checking social media much. Most of their time was still spent practicing or studying. But one evening, when a friend excitedly called and said, "You're going viral," the pianist didn't believe it. It wasn't until they opened the video themselves that the truth hit them. There it was. The same moment they had lived on stage, now being watched by people across oceans. The performance that had been born in a small room on an old piano was now reaching people they'd never met. The comments weren't just about technique. They were about emotion. Listeners from every corner of the world said they could feel something in the music, something real, something human. The pianist sat in silence for a long time, scrolling through the messages. Some people wrote how the performance made them cry. Others said it inspired them to pick up music again after giving up years ago. One message read, "You reminded me that music still has a soul." That one made the pianist smile through tears. As the days passed, journalists began reaching out. News channels wanted to cover the story of the 17-year-old prodigy from Japan. Classical music blogs wrote about the interpretation of Chopin that defied age. Even famous pianists shared the video, leaving encouraging words. The sudden attention felt strange. Just weeks ago, life had been quiet and simple. School, practice, home. Now there were interviews, invitations, and people recognizing them in public. Yet through it all, they tried to stay grounded. Whenever the noise of fame grew too loud, they would go back to the piano, close their eyes, and play the same familiar melodies that once kept them company in the dark. One day, a message arrived from Europe, an invitation to perform in an international youth piano festival. The pianist's teacher was overjoyed. This was the kind of opportunity that could shape a lifetime. The pianist hesitated at first, nervous about performing abroad. But their teacher said softly, "Music has no borders. If you play from the heart, they will understand you," so they accepted. Months later, the pianist found themselves in a grand concert hall in Paris, surrounded by musicians from around the world. They had all seen the viral video, and some even came up to greet the pianist warmly. Despite the distance, the music had already connected them. When the time came to perform, the pianist chose the same piece, Chopin's heroic Polonaise. It had become a part of their story now. As they stepped onto the stage, the hall's golden lights reflected off the polished piano. The silence before the first note felt endless. Then with a deep breath they began. The sound filled the hall, strong, vibrant, alive. Every note carried not just skill but memory. The audience could feel it. The journey, the struggles, the long nights of practice, the hope that had survived through everything. When the final chord thundered out, there was no hesitation this time. The crowd rose instantly, clapping and cheering. After the performance, an elderly pianist approached backstage. He was known as one of the great Chopin interpreters of the century. He smiled kindly and said, "You don't play Chopin. You live him." Those words stayed with the pianist forever. The journey from that small room in Japan to an international stage had been long, but it had never been about fame. The pianist often thought about what truly mattered. It wasn't the applause or the headlines. It was that brief magical moment when music made people feel something, when their heart spoke directly to someone else's. Months after returning home, the pianist continued to study, to practice, and to dream. They began teaching younger students on weekends, passing on the lessons they had learned. Not about notes or speed, but about honesty in music. If you don't feel it, they told their students, no one else will. The viral video continued to grow. Years later, people still watched it and left comments. It became more than just a performance. It became a story of passion, struggle, and belief. It reminded people that greatness doesn't come from luxury or fame. It comes from love, dedication, and the courage to keep going when everything feels impossible. The pianist often visited the same small room where it all began. The old piano was still there, worn but beautiful. Whenever they touched the keys, they could almost hear the echoes of their younger self. The tired child who refused to give up. The dreamer who believed that music could change their life. One night, while playing softly in the dark, they whispered, "Thank you," to the piano. "Thank you for staying through every doubt. Thank you for teaching me how to speak without words." That performance, and the one that shattered barriers, was no longer just a chapter in their life. It had become a bridge between hearts, connecting people who didn't share a language but understood the same emotion. The pianist never saw themselves as a hero, even though many now called them one. They were simply someone who loved music deeply enough to give it everything. And as they played on, the world listened, not just to the sound of the piano, but to the story of a young soul who turned every struggle into a song. The years after that life-changing performance passed quietly but beautifully. The young pianist, once known only in their small hometown, had now become a name whispered in music halls around the world. Yet, despite the fame, their life didn't turn into glamour and flashing lights. It remained humble, steady, and full of music. They continued to live simply, in the same apartment with their mother. The piano still stood in its old corner, the wood slightly cracked, the keys a little worn. It was the same piano that had seen everything: the tears, the exhaustion, and the breakthrough. Even though offers poured in to buy newer, grander instruments, the pianist never replaced it. "This one knows my story," they once said quietly, running their fingers along the keys. In the years that followed, life became a balance between travel and home. Invitations arrived from orchestras, festivals, and conservatories across Europe and Asia. Each performance was met with thunderous applause, but the pianist never played for fame. Every time they sat down in front of the piano, they played like it was the first time, full of emotion, full of truth. Still, fame brought challenges too. The expectations grew heavier. Critics began to compare them with legends, sometimes praising, sometimes questioning. People expected perfection every time, forgetting that behind the pianist's talent was still a young person who could feel tired, nervous, or lost. There were nights when the pianist sat alone in hotel rooms, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were losing touch with the pure love of music that once guided them. The silence after applause sometimes felt too deep. They missed home, the warmth of their mother's cooking, The smell of tea, the familiar creak of the piano bench. One day, after a long tour in Europe, the pianist returned home for the first time in months. Their mother waited at the door, smiling softly, holding out a bowl of hot soup like she always did. For a long moment, the pianist just stood there, realizing how much they had missed this, the quiet love that didn't need words. That night, they sat together watching old performance videos, laughing about small mistakes that no one else had noticed. The next morning, the pianist walked to the local park, a place they hadn't visited since childhood. The air smelled of rain, and the sound of children playing echoed from the distance. Sitting on a bench, they thought about how far life had taken them. Sometimes it felt unreal, how one moment on stage had opened the world. But deep inside, they knew that nothing had really changed. They were still the same person who fell in love with the sound of a single note. A few months later, a well-known music academy offered the pianist a position as a guest mentor for young students. It was the first time they were asked to teach. The thought made them nervous, but they accepted. When they entered the classroom, for the first time, rows of hopeful faces looked up at them, eyes wide with admiration. Some were beginners, others were already talented players. The pianist smiled softly and said, "Music doesn't belong to those who play perfectly. It belongs to those who feel deeply." From that day on, they taught not just techniques, but emotions. They encouraged the students to listen, really listen, to the stories behind the notes. Every composer wrote from life, they explained. Pain, love, loss, hope, they're all hidden inside the music. Your job is to find them. Students loved their classes. They said the pianist's lessons were not about pressure or fear, but about understanding yourself through music. Many of those students would go on to play in competitions and concerts, but what stayed with them most was that feeling of being heard and understood. Outside of teaching, the pianist continued performing, though less frequently. They chose their concerts carefully, focusing on moments that felt meaningful rather than big stages or fame. One memorable performance happened at a hospital, where the pianist played for children who were too sick to leave their beds. The room was small, with soft lighting and the quiet hum of machines in the background. When the pianist began to play, the air changed. The children watched silently, some closing their eyes, others smiling faintly. The music filled every corner, gentle and healing. When the last note faded, the room was still, but it wasn't a sad silence. It was peaceful, warm. The pianist bowed their head, holding back tears. That moment felt more powerful than any grand concert they had ever played. Back at home, they often reflected on how much music had given them and how much it had taken. There had been sacrifices, loneliness, endless hours of practice that no one else saw. But through it all, music had been the one constant, the one friend that never left. Years passed. The pianist grew older, but the same quiet fire still burned inside. Their hands became slightly slower, but their sound grew deeper, more human. Critics began calling them the poet of the piano, someone who played not for show, but for soul. Every year they returned to their hometown to visit the small community center where they once gave their first performance as a child. The building was old now, the paint peeling, but the small stage still stood. Whenever they played there, it felt like coming full circle. The audience was small, neighbors, old teachers, friends, but it was the most honest crowd. After every performance, they would sit with everyone, drinking tea, laughing, and sharing stories. One evening, after finishing a concert at the same hall where they had first played Chopin's heroic Polonaise at 17, the pianist stood alone on stage after everyone had left. The lights dimmed slowly, and the silence wrapped around like an old friend. They placed their hand on the piano and smiled. They thought about the young version of themselves, the child who practiced on cold nights, who doubted, who dreamed. They wished they could reach back in time and whisper, "It was all worth it." The world still remembered them for that one performance that had gone viral. But for the pianist, the true success wasn't in the fame or the trophies. It was in the quiet moments, the connection with strangers who felt something through their music. The students who discovered their own voices, the people who found comfort in the sound of the piano. One morning, while practicing at home, their mother came into the room with a small box. Inside was a faded piece of paper, the program from that national competition years ago. Her eyes were wet when she said, "You never stopped playing with the same heart." The pianist smiled, placing the paper gently on the piano stand. "That's because I never forgot why I started." Later that day, they went out for a walk by the sea. The air was cool, the sky wide and calm. The world had given them so much applause, respect, recognition. But what stayed with them most was the quiet gratitude for every single note that had brought them here. In the following years, the pianist began composing their own music. It wasn't grand or complex. It was simple, full of emotion, the kind of melodies that could make people close their eyes and smile. They called their first piece Home, and when it was released, it touched thousands of hearts. People said it felt like a conversation between the past and the present, a letter from the young pianist to the older one. By the time they turned 30, they had performed across continents, taught hundreds of students, and written music that reached millions. But they never lost the simplicity that defined them. In interviews, when asked about success, they always said, "Success isn't when people remember your name. It's when they remember how you made them feel." And so, the story of the 17-year-old Japanese pianist who once played Chopin's heroic Polonaise with pure heart became more than a moment in history. It became a symbol, a reminder that passion, perseverance, and honesty can break barriers stronger than any wall. Even as the years continued to pass, that viral video still circulated online. New generations watched it, leaving comments like, "I wasn't even born when this was recorded, but it made me cry." The music continued to live, timeless, alive, and full of soul. Sometimes late at night, the pianist would play the heroic Polonaise again, alone in their home. The sound filled the room softly, but their playing had changed. It was no longer fierce or fiery. It was calm, wise, and full of gratitude. When the last note faded into silence, they would smile to themselves, whispering softly, "Thank you, Chopin. Thank you for teaching me how to be brave." And with that, they would close the piano lid, gently, knowing that somewhere, someone in the world might be listening, and feeling the same courage that once lived in the heart of a 17-year-old who dared to dream.